Welcome to the Texas frontier. Cowboys, Indians, pioneer families, and hopeful and hardy people of all stripes once sought new beginnings as they traveled the route you are now driving. Before the days of blacktop and interstates, this path served as the immigrant's trail through the Southwest. It offered stops for supplies and fellowship, forts that offered protection from Indians, and more than a few colorful characters. More importantly, it promised to lead to a land of opportunity for those who were willing to work hard and endure countless hardships. It took a special kind of person to make a life in these parts. As a familiar Texas proverb goes, it is a great country for men and dogs, but hell on women and horses. Sally Reynolds Matthews, a pioneer in this region in the 1850s, was a little more forgiving.
At the time, the name of Texas, more especially West Texas, was a synonym for lawlessness, desperados, and all that was wild and bad. There was also a leaven of good, those rugged, self-disciplined pioneers, men and women of foresight and courage who were willing to brave the dangerous unknown and undergo countless hardships and privations for the sake of widening their horizons and preparing an easier road for their children and those to come after them.
Her sister-in-law, Anne Marie Campbell Reynolds, agreed and figured that pioneering in this area would make for self-reliant citizens in the future.
Our children were early in life well versed in the hardships and privations of pioneer life and learned to depend on their own broad views and patient industry. Not
everyone who came stayed. Another West Texas pioneer announced his failure with the following sign written in charcoal on his abandoned dugout. Gone back east to wife's family. 20 miles to water, 10 miles to wood, 6 inches to hell. Make yourself at home. People came for many reasons. This is still cattle country. Herds rounded up from among these prairies headed north toward Kansas. For those involved, it was not only the most remarkable time of their life, but one that could never be replicated. One of the kings of Texas cowmen, and one who got his start near here, was Charles Goodnight.
Taking all in all, my life on the trail was the happiest part of it. I wish I could find words to describe the companionship and the loyalty of the men towards each other. It is beyond imagination. Bullies and tyrants were unknown among them. They kept their places around a herd and under all circumstances, and if they had to fight, they were always ready. Timid men were not known among them. The life did not fit them.
The tour of the immigrants' route to the West appropriately begins in Fort Worth, a community known as where the West begins. This name goes back to the 1840s when it was thought that this area would be a dividing line between the area becoming occupied by new settlers and the Indians to the west. In 1849, the U.S. Army established Fort Worth on the Bluff, which is now occupied by the beautifully restored Tarrant County Courthouse on Main Street. Notice the restored horse fountain at the corner of Weatherford and Commerce. A drive around the 1895 courthouse covers part of the original grounds of the old fort. As soon as the Army left, settlers began using the old fort buildings and grounds to begin the settlement that today is the city of Fort Worth. This history can be reviewed at a comprehensive historical display at Fire Station No. 1 at 2nd and Commerce Streets. A drive south on Main Street from the courthouse takes you through a redeveloped area called Sundance Square, named for Butch Cassidy's sidekick, the Sundance Kid, who visited Fort Worth and even had that famous photograph taken of the hole-in-the-wall gang while in town. The Chisholm Trail mural at 3rd and Main Street commemorates the great cattle drives that came through town in the years after the Civil War, when Fort Worth was the last major stop along this storied trail. The Fort Worth Convention Center and the Water Gardens occupy much of the area known as Hell's Half Acre during the wild days of the frontier. A drive north from the courthouse on Main Street takes you to the National Historic Stockyards District. From the late 1800s until the 1960s, this area was one of the largest and most active stockyards in the nation. A drive along Exchange Avenue provides the opportunity to see many of the old buildings dating back to the days when this area was filled with cattle, hogs, horses, and mules going to market. the Cowtown Coliseum, the Livestock Exchange Building, the Stockyards Hotel, the White Elephant Saloon Building, and the Stockyard Station, which housed sheep and hogs, provide a real view of the Old West. Each day at 11:30 and at 4, a herd of longhorn cattle is driven along Exchange, where cowboys dress in chaps, hats, and spurs of the old cattle drive era. The Stockyards Museum, the Texas Cowboy Hall of Fame, and the Stockyards Trail Hall of Fame features plaques embedded in the street that honor the heroes of the Old West. They provide additional historical facts about Texas and frontier days. Many special events and activities held in the historic stockyards throughout the year celebrate Fort Worth's Western heritage, such as the Texas Frontier Forts Muster and the Red Steagle Cowboy Gathering. Before leaving Fort Worth and heading west, a drive through the area now known as the Cultural District provides additional insights into Texas history. From the historic stockyards, travel from North Main Street along Northside Drive and University to Camp Bowie, where the Cultural District begins. The street called Camp Bowie derives its name from the huge Army camp of that name, which covered this entire area during World War I. Thousands of troops trained in this area before heading to the trench warfare in Europe. Prior to this time, the area had been home to Indians passing along the Trinity River and later to farmers and ranchers. The federal government built the Will Rogers Memorial Center at this time through the WPA program. Today, the center is the host for the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo, numerous horse and cattle events, and consumer shows. In the same area, 5 museums and a community arts center are also part of the Cultural District. The Fort Worth Museum of Science and History began as a children's museum and now includes a planetarium, an amphitheater, and numerous hands-on educational exhibits. The Amon Carter Museum opened in 1961 and has had several expansions. Its collection includes numerous pieces of art and photography about the frontier. The National Cowgirl Museum also includes materials about the frontier and the American West. The Kimball Art Museum and the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth are both architectural gems with world-famous collections housed in architecturally significant buildings. Immediately south of these museums is the Fort Worth Botanic Garden, which includes considerable plant materials native to Texas and other beautiful flora. Adjacent to the Botanical Gardens is Interstate Highway 30 and the route to Weatherford. Take Interstate 30 west until it merges with I-20 and you reach Parker County and Weatherford. In Weatherford, you'll take a right at exit 414 and continue westward on Highway 180. When you see the Parker County Courthouse straight ahead, listen to the next track. On the square in Weatherford along Highway 180 sits the crown jewel of Parker County, the breathtaking Parker County Courthouse. Built in 1886, this grand courthouse was designed by architect W.C. Dodson in the French Second Empire style and constructed with Parker County limestone. The facades of the 4 sides of this square building are almost identical. The central clock tower extends another 3 stories above the building to complete the grand space. Fully restored to its original interior configuration in 2004, the courthouse boasts one of the largest courtrooms in the state at 4,500 square feet. Patterned ceilings and floors, decoratively painted walls, and the brass ceiling lamps and wooden balconies, details that make this one of the most beautiful courthouses in the state. Weatherford also has a rich Western heritage filled with colorful characters and personalities. Legendary cattle drivers Oliver Loving, Charles Goodnight, and Bose Ickard are just a few of the notorious cowboys who make up Weatherford's history. Both Loving and Goodnight served as the inspiration for Texas author Larry McMurtry's novel Lonesome Dove. Because of this heritage, Western events abound throughout the year. The Goodnight Loving Festival offers a wide variety of Western arts, crafts, and activities. The Parker County Frontier Days and Sheriff's Posse Rodeo is one of the largest in Texas and provides fun for the entire family. Named by the state legislature as the peach capital of Texas, Weatherford and Parker County growers produce the biggest, sweetest, juiciest peaches in all of Texas. The peach is celebrated each year at the Parker County Peach Festival, Weatherford's largest one-day event. Weatherford also holds its own First Monday Trade Days. Hundreds come for the antiques, arts, crafts, food, and fun. One can still enjoy an old-fashioned farmer's market located just a block off the town square. A mile west of the courthouse on Highway 180, Palo Pinto Street, you'll pass a turnoff to the West Bankhead Highway. This road is the Old Mineral Wells Highway and is a pleasant though less direct route to mineral wells. The Bankhead Highway plays an important role in the history of American transportation. In the early 20th century, the automobile began to make its mark on the American culture. Henry Ford's Model T was built in modern assembly lines and sold at prices affordable to more and more Americans. By the 19-teens, thousands of motorists began to call on Congress for good roads with the aid of federal dollars. Alabama Senator John Hollis Bankhead took up the charge and pushed through Congress the Federal Aid Road Act of 1916. To honor the senator, dubbed the father of good roads in the United States Senate, they named the first Southern Transcontinental Highway for him. Built in 1919, the Bankhead Highway stretched from Washington, D.C. to San Diego, California. Interestingly, the highway was not Bankhead's only famous offspring. Two of his sons also served in the Congress, and his granddaughter, Tallulah Bankhead, became a famous Hollywood actress. After passing the old Millsap Road, you're moving into West Parker County. A sign directs you to the Newberry Cemetery, named for the family of Sam Newberry, who arrived in this area of Texas in 1859 as a 13-year-old. His family had come in a caravan of covered wagons from Tennessee. The family finally settled on Grindstone Creek, 12 miles west of Weatherford, and the settlement they started was called Newberry Community in their honor. All that remains today of that community is the cemetery. As a young man, Sam Newberry overcame many perils in this area of Parker County, most of them having to do with hostile Comanches. In April 1869, 16 Comanches led by the infamous Quanah Parker raided near here and stole a number of horses from the settlers. Young Sam and 6 other men gave chase. The pursuit turned into a running fight that headed toward the present location of Mineral Wells and probably occurred close to the route you are now traveling. Quanah Parker, who wore a blue Yankee coat with brass buttons he had secured from a soldier at the Indian Agency at Fort Sill, gave a signal for his raiders to abandon their horses and take cover among several large rocks. Well armed with rifles, the Indians poured out a deadly fire into their pursuers. One youngster, Elbert Doss, fell dead from his horse. Newberry and his companions had to retreat from the position, and the battle came to an end. Quanah Parker later admitted that 9 of his men were killed or wounded in the fight, and that they had lost a dozen horses. Sam Newberry, who carried Doss's body back to his family on his horse, would remain in the area and later become a prominent resident of Weatherford. As you proceed west on Highway 180, you will enter Cool, Texas. Incorporated in the 1960s, Cool currently boasts about 160 residents. Continue on Highway 180 and listen to the next track when you near the historical city of Mineral Wells. As you head into Mineral Wells, you'll see signs for Camp Walters. Named for Brigadier General Jacob F. Walters, this military post has a long and important history, starting in 1925, when it served as a summer training base for the Army National Guard. During World War II, it became one of the more important infantry replacement depots, at one time housing more than 26,000 troops destined for the battlefields in Europe and the Pacific. Officials decommissioned Camp Walters right after that war, but brought it back to life as a training base in 1956, and soon served as the primary helicopter center for the U.S. Army from 1963 to 1973. More than 41,000 students representing over 30 countries trained on the 1,300 aircraft, including OH-23 Ravens, OH-13, and TH-55 type helicopters. The men trained in 20-week stints. Many went on to use their training in Vietnam. Peak output occurred in 1967, with 600 students graduating each month. The welcoming words of the drill sergeants met the future pilots. "Brace the wall, candidates. All parts of your body better be against the wall, candidates." Well, then came the daily dozen physical training regiment and the requirement to run every destination. The young soldiers yearned for a way to get back at their tormentors. Around Christmas 1966, Gary Tulis was a pilot candidate, but relished the arrival of what the men called Grundy Day.
On that day, the candidates literally take over for the day. It's a tradition among the candidates, but the day it occurs must be kept secret from any of the sergeants or officers to prevent their tampering with our Grundy Day plans. We elect a General Grundy, and he personally relieves the company commander for the day. We have a free hand as long as we do nothing destructive or totally out of line, how paralyzing our numbers, and we take orders only from our chosen Grundy leaders. The uniform is tennis shoes, green socks, pants to a sweatsuit, fatigue pants worn over sweatsuit pants and rolled up to the knees, inside-out fatigue shirt, inside-out flight jacket. It has a day-glow orange lining, necktie tied around the neck in a bow, and the baseball cap worn inside out with a handkerchief tucked in like an Arab.
When the day finally arrived, the men had a slate of hijinks to inflict upon their commanders.
We all got up at 3 a.m. and sang Christmas carols at the top of our lungs for half an hour. When we were sure everyone was awake and thoroughly pissed off, we called the company commander at home and told him that he had been relieved of duty by General Grundy, but his presence would be appreciated later in the day at the presentation ceremony. The only reason we really got away with all this stuff was that it was highly organized and absolutely no destructive actions or disrespect was involved. We just did everything back-asswards. Breakfast was a small rite. We all marched down and formed up around the mess hall. Then, on command of "Let's eat," all 300 or more of us piled into the mess hall. We went in every entrance imaginable, all the doors and some of the windows. Needless to say, it took quite a while to get everything straightened out and everybody fed, but we did and had a ball. In the late morning, we had the ceremonies, attended by all the actual company staff as well. There were speeches on how to go brick and goof off. The company executive officer was presented with the Silver Defecation Award, and the company commander with a purple shaft and barbed wire cluster.
The Army deactivated Camp Walters in 1975, but for more than a decade it filled the skies of this region of Texas with brave young men in their strange-looking flying machines. To the right is a reminder of the role that helicopters played in the history of this region. The red-checkered water tower and the concrete flight lines mark a stage field used for teaching takeoffs and hovering and landings. Training was done at the three main heliport at Camp Walters, Maine, Downing, and Dempsey, and 25 stage fields like this. The first 7 stage fields were given Western names, while the rest were named after towns in Vietnam to get the students accustomed to the names. The fields were laid out directionally, the same as the actual towns located in Vietnam. Stage fields were Bronco, Pinto, Ramrod, Mustang, and Sundance. Vietnam names included On Khe, Vung Tau, Thuy Hoa, Cam-Ranh, Hwy, Chu Lai, Sac Tran, My To, Bien Hoa, and Vien Long. At the junctions of Highways 180 and 281 in central Palo Pinto County is the city of Mineral Wells. Rancher J.A. Lynch first settled the area in 1877, and he laid out the town in 1881. The first major connection to the east came in 1882 when a stage line operated between Mineral Wells and Millsap. Although the town first had the name Ednaville, the name soon changed to Mineral Wells because when Lynch dug his first well, he noticed the water tasted different. Although Lynch initially refused to drink the water, his wife did, and she swore that it cured her arthritis. Lynch knew that he had a potential gold mine. He soon started touting the site, claiming that the healing mineral water was odorless, clear, and palatable. Lynch claimed that this palatability was one of the water's best features compared to other waters that hogs won't drink. Once news of these curative waters spread, the town bustled as a health resort. Mrs. C.M. Winkler, a reporter for a literary magazine in East Texas, told of what she found when she arrived in the new resort town in 1883.
The place is only 2 years old, and of course improvements are, as yet, of a temporary character, but there are dry goods, groceries and drugstores, saloons, billiard halls, restaurants, a skating rink, church and boarding houses innumerable, with a population of about 1,500.
It was clear that Mrs. Winkler was also impressed by the claims of the health-generating benefits of the waters.
While strolling through the town, many who are well, healthy-looking men were pointed out to me as having come here bent with rheumatism, blind with diseased eyes, and one girl, waiting in a restaurant, cheerful and happy, was brought here a raving maniac, restored by this health-giving water.
This claim to the improvement of mental health was not solitary in Mineral Wells. After drinking water from one of the wells, one woman claimed that the liquid had cured her insanity. Local children dubbed the fluid Crazy Water, and the name stuck. Soon locals bottled Crazy Water and shipped it all over the country, claiming it cured hysteria and a wealth of other mental problems. Interestingly, the waters do contain lithium, a mineral still used today in the treatment of bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and depression. At the turn of the 20th century, bathhouses and resort hotels attracted thousands of visitors a year. By 1920, the town was being billed as the South's greatest health resort, and it boosted nearly 8,000 residents and 400 mineral wells. Two large luxury hotels, the Baker and the Crazy Water Hotel, now a retirement home, attracted famous visitors to the town, including Will Rogers, D.W. Griffith, Marlene Dietrich, Tom Mix, General John J. Blackjack Pershing, Elliott Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, Jean Harlow, Clark Gable, Judy Garland, Helen Keller, Roy Rogers, Ronald Reagan, the Three Stooges, and many others. By mid-century, the population had swelled to more than 12,000, and it now has nearly 17,000 residents. The Baker Hotel building still towers above downtown on the right as you travel west on Highway 180, but it still has remained empty since the early 1980s. The stories of ghosts and hauntings began in the Baker long before it ever closed. A porter who worked there during the 1950s and 1960s was the first known witness to the ghost of a woman on the 7th floor. She was possibly the mistress of the hotel manager. Distraught from her affair, she jumped to her death from the top of the building. The year of the incident has not been verified, but the room she stayed in, apparently quite comfortably, was the suite on the southeast corner of the 7th floor. Many have reported smelling her perfume, and her spirit is said to be quite flirtatious with men she may fancy. Recently, a woman who worked as a maid in the hotel reported that on several occasions she found glasses in the room with red lipstick stains on the rims. This took place at times when no one was staying in the room. The building may be one of the most haunted places in Texas, if not the country. One psychic claimed to have counted at least 49 different spirits in the building. The investigations are not complete and are currently being continued by DeGulf's Ghost, another professional paranormal investigating team. With so much paranormal activity, the Baker has become a hotspot for investigators. It is hopeful that in time, more proof of the restless spirits will be documented. The hotel remains a grand old structure, though containing thousands of stories of the people that stayed there, some during their last days as they sought cures for terrible illnesses. So if you get the chance to visit the beautiful old hotel, please have respect for those who may still be there, the Baker's patrons who refuse to check out. Tours of the Baker are conducted weekends during warmer months, and if you happen to visit the 7th floor, don't be surprised if you catch the faint scent of a young lady's perfume as she lurks the old halls, lost in time. As you leave Mineral Wells, notice there is not nearly the congestion and population in Palo Pinto County as in Parker County. This state of affairs is most likely the effect of the case of the $1 million cow. The story takes us back to 1880, when the tracks of the Texas and Pacific Railroad were making their way westward out of Weatherford. Company surveyors and engineers worked well ahead of the construction, finding proper rights-of-way for this transportation miracle of the 19th century. These railroad employees often found themselves in isolated areas, and instead of carrying large stores of food with them, they usually worked out arrangements with local ranchers to allow them to kill cows as needed for sustenance. Then they would send the hides back to headquarters where the brand would be identified and a check would be sent to the appropriate rancher. Then came the cow that would literally change the direction of the railroad and perhaps the future of Palo Pinto County. This cow was not, by all appearances, special in any way. A spotted longhorn that probably would have brought $5 to its owner if sold at market. But this cow, however humble, was destined to change the fortunes of thousands. Shortly after the T&P Railroad Surveyor Camp was set up in Palo Pinto County, one of the employees shot and killed the fated cow. Unfortunately, when the cow's owner learned of the deed, he considered the action theft. He rushed into Palo Pinto and organized an impromptu meeting with other ranchers from the area. With emotions whipped up to a fever pitch, men were heard to exclaim,
"We don't want our cows killed by engineers or by trains either.
We don't want any dang railroads cutting up our range."
The armed mob headed toward the railroad camp. The head engineer for the T&P quelled the mob, but he then reported the difficult situation back to headquarters. Company managers, more used to being courted for their tracks rather than being threatened, angrily sent back the message to bypass the troublemakers and their range even if it cost $1 million. The surveyors dutifully turned the direction of the tracks to the south, and the county seat, Palo Pinto, is still a small town no bigger than it was in 1880. The town of Palo Pinto is the seat of Palo Pinto County. The town began life as Golconda in 1857 when the county was organized. Settlers had already lived in the area for 2 years, attracted by the fertile soils of the Brazos River Valley. In 1859, settlers changed the name of the town to Palo Pinto. Although the exact reasons for the name change was never recorded formally, some old-timers used to say,
Court was in session and the judge and jury were tired of confinement. The bottle was freely passed at the last court recess and the judge decided to adjourn for 99 years. The order was put on record, and the name of Golconda had to be changed before court could be heard again. Palapinto was the new name chosen, naturally.
In 1865, a 21-year-old resident of the town, George Reynolds, drove a herd of cattle from Palapinto to Fort Sumner, New Mexico, blazing a cattle-driving trail along the old Butterfield overland stage route that would later be made famous by fellow Palapinto County residents Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving. The town took a major blow in 1880 when the Texas and Pacific Railroad bypassed it, but it continued to survive as the county seat and trading center. The town experienced a revival in the 1910s with the oil boom. By 1915, its population peaked at 23,000. In 1940, residents replaced the original courthouse with the one still present today. It's representative of the pre-World War II era courthouses with brass knobs and eagle-encrusted light fixtures. 1 block south of the square stands the original 1881 Sandstone Jail, which serves as the cornerstone of the Palapinto Museum area. Looking at the courthouse square in the middle of town, imagine yourself as a stranger in town on a warm summer evening at the turn of the last century, and you might have been privileged enough for the local citizens to allow you to participate in one of their favorite pastimes, a badger fight. Former Palapinto Sheriff Gib Abernathy tells a story of what happened to a New Yorker, a salesman by the name of Sharp, who was passing through.
There wasn't much going on the town square on summer evenings. And when a stranger came to town, he was usually initiated to a badger fight. If he could take it, he was accepted into the inner circle. If he couldn't take it, well, he just didn't belong. Now you have to picture the town square in 1900. There was no gleaming highway leading over the hill. There were no automobiles, no buses, no trucks, no airship roaring overhead, or no radios and no television. There were no picture shows. Store lights, save those in the saloons, were out early and only the moon lighted the square. The dusty road leading over the hill could not be traveled again until morning. It was natural that the badger fight came into popularity. Many a roaring good time was had by the male population while the women folk were quietly quilting at home or chatting on the porch with their neighbors. The badger was put under a barrel with a string tied to it. A citizen held the dog, and at the proper time, the string would be pulled, the badger liberated, and the fight would take place. But first, the betting was done, and enthusiasm built up around the fight.
On the evening in question, Mr. Sharp was sitting on the porch of the hotel when several men approached him and asked if he'd ever seen a badger. He said Palapinto was as far west as he had ever been, and he would love to see one. So the citizens cordially invited him to the fight on the square.
There must have been a dozen men in a circle around the upturned barrel, and the excitement was high. Even the dog was baying and sniffing around the barrel, eager for a fight. Betting was rampant, about 50-50. Some citizens bet on the badger, others on the dog. At last, Mr. Sharp could stand the excitement no longer, and he too placed a $2 bet on the badger. Then the question of pulling the badger and holding the dog arose. Which citizen would have these outstanding honors? At last, Mr. Sharp was given the honor of holding the dog because he was a stranger in town. Highly excited, he squatted on the ground on the inner circle, holding the quivering dog by the forelegs. The canine strained every muscle to free himself as the men shouted, "Sick 'em, sick 'em, get that badger." The excitement was at high heat when the umpire shouted, "Ready, go!" The salesman let go of the trembling dog, the string was pulled, and out came the badger.
The badger was a familiar and homely article. In fact, it was an exact replica of the chamber pot Mr. Sharp had glimpsed under the bed when his host had shown him his room in the hotel.
Roars of laughter floated away into the cedar-covered hills, and the New York drummer relighted his well-smoked cigar and invited the crowd into the saloon for drinks. He was a real sport, even if he was from New York. I'll bet he never forgot that badger fight in West Texas.
Turn on the next track as you near the town of Caddo. Caddo, at the junction of US Highway 180, Farm Road 717, and Park Road 33 in east central Stevens County, was established in the late 1870s on a Caddo Indian campsite. In 1880, the tiny town had 60 residents, 2 churches, a school, and a post office. The Ranger oil boom of 1916-1917 increased Caddo's population to 1,000 by 1920. oil was discovered on the W.L. Carey farm near Caddo in 1916, then on the L.W. Wright property at Caddo. These finds kept interest high and were harbingers of the Breckenridge boom that came in 1917. Caddo had fallen to 600 residents in 1940, but World War II and the post-war era saw the town decline to below its 1880 size. Highway 180 will take you through the town of Breckenridge, the topic of the next track. At the intersection of Highways 180 and 183 is Breckenridge, the seat of Stevens County. The town originated in 1854 as Picketteville, but in 1876, when the town became county seat, it took the name Breckenridge in honor of former U.S. Senator from Kentucky and Vice President John C. Breckenridge. Through the beginning of the First World War, Breckenridge was a sleepy hamlet of about 500 residents. But all of that soon changed with the discovery of oil in nearby Ranger in 1916. Wildcatters began to drill around Breckenridge in 1918. And within 2 years, the town burst at the seams as thousands of oil workers and speculators arrived on the scene, throwing up acres of shacks and tents throughout the town. By 1921, the population had surpassed 30,000 in this boom town, and more than 200 wells appeared within the city limits. Gamblers, liquor sellers, and prostitutes also occupied the city. By that summer, the Wichita Falls, Ranger, and Fort Worth Railroad reached Breckenridge, soon to be joined by the Cisco and Northeastern. By the 1920s, oil production slowed and the population dwindled. Today, Breckenridge has about 5,600 residents and still has petroleum-based industries. It also serves as a recreation base for those going to the Hubbard Creek Reservoir just northwest of the city. Other states were carved or born. Texas grew from hide and horn, wrote Shackelford County native and famous Texas poet Berta Hart Nance. This is the country that inspired that line. Shackelford County consists of 887 square miles of loamy clay topsoil that sits on top of a surface rock of Permian limestone. The Clear Fork of the Brazos River winds in and out of the northern part of the county, and most of the creeks in the area are tributaries to the Brazos. Most of the county was once an open, short grass prairie, but today most of the former prairie land consists of mesquite and chaparral savanna. In the 18th century, Apache Indians called the region home, but they were eventually driven out by the Comanches, who enjoyed access to the great southern herd of bison that ranged through that area. In the 1840s, Captain Randolph B. Marcy of the U.S. Army led an exploring expedition through the region. Settlers started to raise cattle in the area in the 1850s. After the Civil War, the Army constructed Fort Griffin here, and a civilian community generally known as the Flat soon followed. The fort and the Flat would soon be bustling with activity with the influx of buffalo hunters into the region in the mid-1870s. Fort Griffin would take on the reputation of a true frontier boom town with gamblers, saloons, gunfights, and vigilantes. In 1874, citizens petitioned to organize the county, and they named it for Texas Revolution hero Dr. Jack Shackelford. Although Fort Griffin served as the temporary county seat, citizens soon organized a new town in the center of the county to serve that function. Continue to follow Highway 180 and turn on the next track as you follow the Texas Forts Trail and enter Shackelford County and the charming town of Albany, Texas. This country was contested between U.S. soldiers and the resident Comanches and Kiowas. Camp Cooper, established in the late 1850s, was an early military post in this part of Texas and served as the headquarters of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. The future Confederate general was not impressed with his stay near the Clear Fork of the Brazos. In a letter home, he wrote,
"My servants have informed me they cannot go back to Camp Cooper. I fear it is too dreary. I wish there were anything interesting here to relate to you, but sadly we are in a desert of dullness out of which no real substance is drawn. My rattlesnake, my only pet, I regret to say, is dead. He encountered an ailment of unknown origin and would not eat his frogs, and unfortunately passed on during the night."
After the Civil War, U.S. troops established Fort Griffin in 1868 as part of a final line of forts through the region. Troops from this post campaigned against hostile raiders until the late 1870s. The town that developed below the post on Government Hill became known as the Flat, and hosted such notorious characters as Doc Holliday, Wyatt Earp, Lottie Dino, John Wesley Hardin, and John Larn, a man so tough that he once bragged, "I believe that if a man was to shoot me through the heart, I would kill that man 'fore I died." Today, the remains of the fort are maintained as Fort Griffin State Park, open to visitors year-round. The official herd of longhorn owned by the state of Texas also live at the park. Each of these impressive beasts is emblazoned with the state of Texas brand, a Lone Star. Visitors can see the herd as it grazes on the lush green grass that lines the clear fork of the Brazos, which runs through the grounds. Oil came roaring into this region as well, turning many a scrub cow operation into a thriving oil lease. As one West Texan saying goes, cattle also grow fatter in the shade of a pump jack. Not only did this petroleum wealth build personal fortunes, it also aided the less fortunate. When drillers struck oil on the Cook Ranch north of Albany, Texas, Mrs. Missouri Matilda Nail Cook dedicated the royalties to create the W.I. Cook Memorial Hospital on January 29, 1929, at 1212 West Lancaster Street in Fort Worth, when the polio epidemic was spreading in the United States in 1952. The facility expanded to 72 beds and changed its mission to care exclusively for the needs of children and its name to Cook Children's Hospital. The current Cook Children's Medical Center resulted from the merger of this hospital and the Fort Worth Children's Hospital in 1989. The town of Albany was named by William Kruger, one of the founders, for his former home, Albany, Georgia. The site was selected for the county seat to supersede Fort Griffin on November 8, 1874. Cattle drivers going up the Western Trail to Dodge City soon began to use the town as a supply point. The arrival of the Texas Central Railroad in December 1881 made Albany a shipping point for cattle. Cattle and sheep raising dominated the local economy until the emergence of the oil industry in the 20th century. Discovery of the Cook oil field in 1926 and later discoveries have made Albany an oil drilling, producing, and supply center. Ranching continues to be an important part of the town's economic life. The town has reminders nearly on every street corner of the early days of West Texas. To the right is the old depot building that used to service the Texas Central Railroad. It now houses the Visitors Bureau. Nearby, you will notice the double-pen dog trot cabin known as the Ledbetter House. Notice the lay of the logs. This vertical arrangement worked better with a locally available cedar and was known as picket-style construction. No visit to Albany, even a quick passing through, is complete without making the circuit around the old Shackelford County Courthouse, the crown jewel of the town. For 117 years, the Shackelford County Courthouse has stood the test of time. It is a grand edifice that replaced a modest two-room cedar picket courthouse. The county hired J.E. Flanders, a noted Dallas architect, to design their new Temple of Justice. Its style is termed Italianate for its cornice brackets and low roof, similar to country villas of the Mediterranean. The structure is hand-carved from native limestone and stretches 3 stories tall. It is topped with a bell and clock tower that still guides the life of Albany residents. In early November 1874, an election determined the exact location of the courthouse. After many delays, the courthouse was finally erected in late 1884. After the building was completed, the stone superintendent on the job said this building will stand for 500 years if not destroyed by fire or providential interference. Nearby, the old jail art museum is housed in a restored 1878 stone hoosgow, the first permanent jail in the county seat. The collection contains some great examples of art from across the planet, including Chinese tomb figures dating from the 3rd century BC. During the last 2 weeks of June every year, the history of this town and the once lively Fort Griffin is celebrated with a musical production known as the Fort Griffin Fandangle, an outdoor theater production that originated in 1938. A long-running town tradition, the Fandangle is cast by proud Albany residents, many who have performed in the show since childhood. The extravaganza brings visitors from throughout the region and state who enjoy dining at local restaurants and catching the Fandangle under the stars at a nearby amphitheater. You may notice along the way a small highway sign with crossed sabers denoting the Texas Forts Trail. In 1968, the Texas Department of Transportation created the original 10 travel trails of Texas. These driving routes were established in conjunction with the Hemisphere in San Antonio and were designed to get people out to discover all of Texas. The Texas Forts Trail was one of these original trails. The Texas Forts Trail is not all-inclusive. It is strictly a geographic grouping of 8 frontier forts in west central Texas. Since 1968, a variety of maps have been published, and the Highway Department has maintained the signage along the highways. As you travel down the highway, the views out the right of your vehicle reveal the grassy prairies that provided homes and range for more than 1 million head of buffalo. This in turn attracted Indians who harvested the animals for food. White buffalo hunters came in the 1870s, as did cattle raisers. Indians once called this country home. Mogara, Penatea Comanche. Remember it as a great place to live, especially among the oaks and elms of the Brazos River bottoms. The coming of the white man ruined it. The famous Kiowa chief Satana lamented that he could not live on this land forever undisturbed.
These soldiers cut down my timber. They kill my buffalo. And when I see that, my heart feels like bursting. We were happy. Then you came.
The soldiers that came to keep the peace and sometimes fought these Indians thought the natives were both crafty and majestic. For the average soldier, this sort of action was anything but glamorous. Lieutenant Fitzhugh Lee of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, and Robert E. Lee's son, wrote,
I can now scarcely realize that I have passed through such a severe ordeal. Indian warfare is not the most glorious in the world, hard fighting after riding miles and miles through the hot sun, often suffering for the want of water and sometimes food, exposed alternately to the heat of the sun and the rains, and getting but little, if any, glory.
As you can imagine, desertions and poor morale plagued the army on the frontier. Those that served out a tour of duty often did not repeat the process. Texas Rangers joined in the efforts to suppress the Indians. These state forces offered quite a contrast to the regular U.S. troops. James Pike described them.
Imagine men dressed in every variety of costume, except the ordinary uniform, armed with double-barrel shotguns, squirrel rifles, and Colt's six-shooters, mounted on small, wiry, half-wild horses with Spanish saddles and Mexican spurs, unshaven, unwashed, undisciplined, but brave and generous men, riding pell-mell along roads, over prairies, and through woods, and you will be able to form a correct conception of a squad of Texan Rangers on the march. In such a band, it is impossible to distinguish officers from privates, as the former have no distinct dress, and all act alike.
Even these stalwarts found Indian fighting to be a challenge. Captain Buck Berry.
The country was so irregular that a war party might scatter and the warriors hide themselves until the pursuit had passed, overlooked them, or been abandoned.
As you proceed along, you will exit off US 180 and head down Texas 351 toward Abilene. Continue on Texas Highway 351 and you will cross through Jones and Callahan counties. Turn on the next track as you enter Taylor County and Hamby, Texas. Hamby, on State Highway 351, 5 miles east of Abilene in northeastern Taylor County, touches the corners of Taylor, Jones, Callahan, and Shackelford counties. The cotton and oil community was first named Corners. For the county corners, its boundary touched. Hamby Richardson, a bachelor from Georgia, owned the earliest store there shortly before 1900. He was the first postmaster when the community's post office opened in 1902. After the name Corners was rejected by postal authorities, friends urged Richardson to send in his first name since the place was already popularly called Hamby's. After the Hamby post office opened, a small settlement with several businesses sprang up there. Though the post office closed in 1919, many of these businesses continued until the mid-1930s, when the community's population was estimated at 20. Taylor County is 917 square miles of prairie in the rolling plains vegetation region of West Texas. It's covered with grasses, mesquite, and live oak trees. Taylor is also traversed by a line of hills stretching from east to west known as the Callahan Divide. The Brazos River Basin is to the north of these hills, and the Colorado River Basin to the south. The Penateca Band of the Comanche Indians dominated this region through the mid-19th century, following the migrating bison of the Great Southern Herd as it crossed through here on its way to the Colorado River Basin in the winter and back to the north in the summer. In 1858, the Texas legislature established the county and named it for Texas revolutionary heroes and Alamo defenders Edward, James, and George Taylor. But for the next few decades, the region was still dominated by the Buffalo and Comanches, who tended to favor one gap in the hills that would later come to be called Buffalo Gap. It was in this live oak-covered valley that the first permanent town was founded in 1874. The town of Buffalo Gap. Primarily attracting buffalo hunters, the town became the county seat in 1878 when the county was organized. In 1881, however, the Texas and Pacific Railroad bypassed Buffalo Gap and laid plans for a new town north of the county seat, Abilene. By 1883, citizens voted to move the county seat to this larger city. Abilene is still the largest city in the county, but the original Taylor County Courthouse, built in 1879, is still standing and open for visitors as part of the Buffalo Gap Historic Village in beautiful Buffalo Gap. As you drive roughly southwest, you can begin to make out the line of hills known as the Callahan Divide south of Abilene. On a clear day, you can see two significant cuts in the hills, the one on the left, or the westernmost of the two, being Buffalo Gap. The Great Southern Herd of buffalo moved through this pass during its annual migration, sometime taking more than 3 days to amble past dumbfounded observers. J. Wright Moore, an adventurer from the East Coast, had come to the Great Plains to hunt buffalo and supply meat to the Army. He soon realized that a fortune could be made in hides. With the tacit support of the Army, after all, if the buffalo were all gone, the Indians could no longer roam free. An army of hunters estimated at 1,500 men came to Texas and made short work of the once vast herd. In 4 years, the animals were largely gone. The technique they used was called a stand. As the slaughter continued through the mid to late 1870s, rugged yet enterprising men came to the plains making as much as $10,000 in a single 4-month season. Anyone that could took a turn on the plains, hoping for a large windfall of buffalo money. Frank Conrad was a merchant in Fort Griffin, Texas.
It was in the fall of '76, and I was engaged in the back end of a storehouse and heard someone ask the boys who ran this shebang, where the boss was. I went forward and met the man. He wanted some ammunition and asked if I had plenty. I told him I had. Well, he said, give me 3 kegs of powder and about 400 pounds of lead. Well, that nearly took my breath away. I asked him if he was shooting artillery and what his occupation was. He said he was a buffalo hunter. And I told him that I only had 2/3 of a keg, as I general thing I only sold a keg in 3 months. I had a lot of talk with the man and found he was a forerunner of a lot of Kansas men coming to Texas to kill buffalo. And after thinking the matter over, I decided to send to Bridgeport, Connecticut for 25 kegs. And before it came, there were men who arrived that would have taken twice as much.
Welcome to the Friendly Frontier, a town of 116,000 people from all walks of life. Abilene's economy represents all of the themes that have figured so prominently in the development of West Texas. Hardy pioneers, cowboys, the railroad, oil wildcatters, military men, preachers, teachers, schools, and churches. The city was started on a cold and blustery spring day in 1881 through an auction for lots along the new route of the Texas and Pacific Railroad. Advertised as the future great city of West Texas, nearly 1,000 people camped out along the rail route waiting to start a new life in this area with a bright future. By 1883, the city had incorporated and was home to 2 newspapers, numerous churches, and a public school. The town was dubbed Abilene because founders hoped the area would become a major cattle center like Abilene, Kansas. Cattle drives figured prominently in the area's early economy. The arrival of the railroad and fenced ranges, however, ended that romantic tradition. Today, the early history of settling this area is celebrated and passed down to future generations at a high-technology interactive history experience museum named Frontier, Texas, located in a limestone building with architecture that echoes the early Texas forts. Easily visible just as Highway 80 reaches Abilene's vibrant and beautifully maintained restored downtown, Frontier, Texas also serves as the official Abilene and Texas Forts Trail Visitor Center in the T&P Historic District. Beautifully restored railroad buildings now house offices, an event center, and a local and well-known candy maker, Vleda's Candies, a long-running family-owned business. Guests who step inside the National Center for Children's Illustrated Literature are shocked to learn that the beautiful gallery and activity center once served as a car garage. Today, the location celebrates children's first exposure to art, storybook illustrations, by displaying the original art created for award-winning children's books. At the nearby Grace Museum, world-class art exhibits, history, and children's museums occupy a building that once served travelers along the railroad. A co-op of local artists display their works at the Center for Contemporary Arts downtown, where admission is always free, if you can resist purchasing the art on display. The area's role as a training base for World War II soldiers is chronicled at the 12th Armored Division Memorial Museum downtown, a site where soldiers who fought in that division and others still reunite regularly for fellowship and to recall their days training at Abilene's Camp Barclay. The beautiful Spanish colonial revival-style Paramount Theater still shows live productions, classic and contemporary movies, while the first hotel that ever bore the name of the world-famous hotelier Conrad Hilton now operates as apartments in the beautifully restored Windsor Building, where the ballroom where Lawrence Welk once played is still used for glamorous events. Today, apartment buildings, numerous restaurants, art galleries, retail shops, and bustling offices keep Abilene's downtown full of life. On the second Thursday of each month, downtown venues and vendors stay open late to celebrate Art Walk. The streets bustle with the sounds of street musicians, vendors, and children who take part in the activities at the arts venues where the admission is always free during that evening. Abilene's downtown is a lovely metaphor for the heritage of this area. It's a place where history collides with the contemporary, a city that celebrates its western roots while blossoming into a progressive, cultured city on the Texas frontier.